The midday sun bounced mercilessly off the polished chrome of the ultra-luxury business jet, casting a blinding glare across the tarmac of Crestview Executive Airfield. Meredith Sterling stood at the base of the boarding stairs, a portrait of absolute corporate dominance. Her tailored emerald suit was immaculate, her gaze sharp enough to cut glass. In front of her stood a man in oil-stained canvas coveralls, his work boots scuffed and worn, holding the hand of a small, quiet girl. Meredith's lips curled into a cold, mocking smile as she looked down at them, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet runway. "Fly it perfectly," she said, her tone dripping with aristocratic sarcasm, "and I might just marry you." The small entourage of assistants, executives, and ground managers erupted into polite, sycophantic laughter. The man didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply stood there, his jaw tight, his eyes steady, anchoring himself against the public insult. But before he could turn away and walk back to the safety of the maintenance bays, a frantic technician shattered the laughter, sprinting toward them with a face as white as a sheet. Garrett Vance was 36 years old, and he was a man defined by the ghosts he chose to leave behind. To the rest of the world at Crestview Airfield, he was just Garrett, the quiet, meticulous mechanic who worked the late shift line, the guy who could find a microscopic hairline fracture in a titanium wing spar just by listening to the hum of the airframe. He wore a heavy silver watch that had stopped ticking years ago, and he never talked about where he came from. His hands were calloused, his knuckles permanently stained with hydraulic fluid, and he was entirely content with the invisibility his uniform provided. It was a self-imposed exile, a masterpiece of quiet simplicity designed for one single purpose: his 6-year-old daughter, Chloe. Chloe was his entire universe. She was a delicate child with observant wide eyes, who spent her afternoons sitting on a plastic crate in the corner of the maintenance hangar, coloring in sketchbooks while her father carefully rebuilt turbine assemblies. 3 years ago, a devastating civilian transport accident had claimed Garrett's wife, a tragedy that triggered a complete collapse of the life he once knew. Before the grief, Garrett had been something entirely different. He was a legendary military test pilot, a man who had logged thousands of hours commanding experimental, unstable aircraft at classified testing grounds. His name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones within deep aviation circles, his records locked behind multi-layered government security clearances. But when the sky took his wife, and a subsequent near-fatal system failure on an experimental prototype almost cost him his own life, Garrett made a silent vow. He would never gamble his existence against an altitude or a deadline again. He traded the high-altitude adrenaline for the absolute certainty of the ground. He chose the grease, the predictable hours, and the complete lack of a spotlight so he could guarantee he would always be there to tuck Chloe into bed. Meredith Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Global Initiatives, operated on an entirely different plane of reality. She did not understand simplicity. She understood leverage, velocity, and absolute control. Her multi-billion-dollar empire spanned logistics, defense contracting, and high-tech aerospace, and she viewed human beings through the rigid lens of utility. If someone could not accelerate her timeline or increase her profit margin, they were merely background noise. Today, her schedule was calculated down to the second. A monumental 9-figure merger was waiting for her signature in Chicago, and her private G650 was her high-speed boardroom. When she noticed Garrett standing near the boarding stairs with a child, delivering a specialty dual-channel telemetry sensor to the flight crew, she saw him as an offensive glitch in her perfectly ordered environment. The contrast between his grease-smudged face and her pristine million-dollar aircraft irritated her. The mocking dare she threw at him wasn't just a joke, it was a weaponized reminder of the social hierarchy. The laughter of her entourage felt like a physical weight on the tarmac, but Garrett's face remained a mask of unreadable calm. He looked down at Chloe, whose grip on his fingers had tightened. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she looked up at the wealthy woman. "Why is she being mean to us?" Garrett knelt down, entirely ignoring the wealthy executives around them, his deep, grounded voice carrying a natural, soothing warmth that instantly lowered Chloe's shoulders. "Remember what we talked about, Chloe," he murmured softly. "Dignity isn't something people can give you, which means it's not something they can take away. Silence is the loudest thing in the room when you know exactly who you are. We're here to fix the machine, not to argue with the passengers." He stood back up, preparing to lead Chloe away from the toxic display, but the panicked technician, Frank Alvarez, burst through the circle of executives. "Miss Sterling," Frank gasped. his chest heaving as he clutched a rugged diagnostic tablet. "We have a catastrophic system failure. The primary flight control computer is completely locking up during the pre-flight calibration sequence. It's throwing a fatal error code on the main stabilizer bus. The plane is grounded." Meredith's icy composure fractured instantly. "What do you mean, grounded?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous, razor-sharp register. "I have a signing ceremony in less than 4 hours." "I don't pay you for excuses, Frank. Get Captain Mercer on the line. Get this bird in the air." Frank looked like he wanted the tarmac to swallow him whole. "Captain Mercer is grounded in Atlanta due to the severe weather front, ma'am. And even if he were here, no commercial pilot alive will touch this cockpit. The error code means the computer is misinterpreting the physical control inputs. If we take off, the automated system could fight the pilot and rip the tail section clean off the fuselage. It's a suicide mission." Meredith frantically pulled out her secure satellite phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she dialed private charter services, military contacts, and high-end aerospace brokers, her voice rising in a rare display of fractured control. Every single call ended with the same devastating logistical reality. The weather was closing in, there were no backup jets available within a 300-mile radius, and the automation error was an absolute no-fly directive. Her massive corporate power was suddenly entirely useless against the hard laws of software and physics. Furious, desperate, and unwilling to accept defeat, Meredith turned her gaze back toward Garrett, who was quietly securing his tool bag. Her eyes flashed with bitter, defensive sarcasm. "Well, Mr. Philosopher," she snapped loudly, "since you're the master of the grease pit and you seem to know so much about these machines, why don't you show us what you've got? Can you fly it, or are you only good for wiping down the landing gear?" First Officer Julian Cross, exiting the cabin to assess the commotion, let out a dry, dismissive scoff. "With all due respect, Miss Sterling, the guy is a line mechanic. He changes oil filters and checks tire pressure. He doesn't command 40-ton, fly-by-wire aerospace platforms." Garrett paused. He didn't look at Meredith, nor did he look at the arrogant first officer. Instead, his eyes locked onto the diagnostic tablet in Frank's trembling hands. "Frank," he said, his voice entirely devoid of hesitation, vibrating with a sudden, absolute authority that caused everyone on the tarmac to freeze. "Is the stabilizer bus throwing a hard code 882 Delta?" Frank blinked, completely stunned. "Yes." "How did you know that?" "It's a ghost in the legacy architecture," Garrett said, stepping forward, his entire demeanor shifting from an underestimated mechanic to an absolute master of the craft. "The system isn't broken. It's trapped in a feedback loop because the ground crew used the wrong calibration sequence for the secondary actuator. A standard pilot can't fly it because they rely on the automation to stay alive. But it can be flown by someone who knows exactly how to fight the computer and win." He reached into his canvas tool bag, bypassed the wrenches, and pulled out a worn, black leather-bound military flight log. He placed it gently on the baggage cart next to Chloe's coloring book. "Call the Federal Aviation Administration Tower," Garrett commanded Frank, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Tell them to file an emergency special clearance flight under the call sign Spectre 6. Tell them the captain in command is Garrett Vance. Service number 441 Alpha Echo." Meredith Sterling's jaw dropped as she stared at the logbook, the sudden realization hitting her like a physical blow. The quiet mechanic she had just publicly humiliated wasn't just a pilot, he was a ghost from the highest echelons of military aviation, and he was currently the only man alive who could save her empire. The silence on the tarmac was absolute. Frank Alvarez stared at the worn black leather logbook as if it were an unexploded bomb. His fingers, greasy from working the fuel lines, hovered over his diagnostic tablet before he frantically began typing the service credentials Garrett Vance had just recited. Julian Cross, the first officer, let out a nervous, defensive chuckle, though the arrogance had completely drained from his face. "This is ridiculous," Julian muttered, adjusting his gold-trimmed pilot cap. "Miss Sterling, you can't seriously let a line mechanic play hero with a $100 million airframe. He doesn't even have a commercial rating on this specific variant." Frank didn't answer him. He was staring at the red flashing text on his tablet, which had suddenly cleared, replaced by a secure Department of Defense encryption splash screen. The local air traffic control tower chief was already patching through to Frank's ground radio. The radio crackled loudly, the voice of the controller sharp and filled with an immediate, unmistakable deference. "Hangar 1, be advised. The waiver for Spectre 6 has been approved at the highest federal level. Special clearance under the Phoenix Protocol is authorized. Captain Vance is cleared for left seat command. All standard pre-flight delays are waived. Repeat, he has absolute priority. Meredith Sterling felt the ground beneath her designer heels shift. Her mind, usually a hyper-efficient supercomputer capable of calculating risks in milliseconds, stalled completely. She looked at the encrypted clearance on the screen, then back at Garrett. The man in front of her hadn't changed his posture. He hadn't gloated. He hadn't thrown her cruel words back in her face. He simply stood there, checking the strap on his daughter's backpack, completely unfazed by the sudden bureaucratic earthquake he had just triggered. The sheer contrast between her chaotic, high-volume desperation and his unshakable, silent gravity was terrifying to her. For the first time in her career, her wealth felt like nothing more than paper. Chloe looked up at her father, her small hand reaching out to touch the worn canvas of his jumpsuit. "Daddy, do you have to fly the big, shiny airplane now?" she asked, her wide eyes reflecting the bright midday sun. "Is it dangerous?" Garrett immediately dropped to one knee, lowering himself to her eye level. The entire world, the frantic executives, the idling jet engines, the looming multi-billion-dollar deadline, completely ceased to exist for him. He offered Chloe a gentle, grounding smile that instantly washed away the tension on her small face. "No, sweetheart, it is not dangerous for us," Garrett said, his voice a calm, steady anchor. "The airplane is just confused right now. It needs someone to speak its language and tell it how to behave. I am just going to show it the right way to fly, and then we are going to get ice cream. You are going to sit right behind me in the observer seat, safe and sound. Deal?" Chloe nodded, her anxiety evaporating instantly as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "Deal," she whispered. Meredith watched this interaction, a strange, unfamiliar tightness gripping her chest. She was used to commanding thousands of employees, dealing with ruthless corporate raiders, and barking orders that altered financial markets. Yet, seeing this man effortlessly project absolute safety to a child in the middle of a mechanical crisis left her feeling profoundly hollow. She realized that with all her billions, she could not buy that kind of peace. She could not command that level of genuine trust. When she looked down, she noticed her own hands were trembling slightly. The pressure of the impending merger, combined with the sudden realization that her life was now entirely dependent on a man she had just insulted, was suffocating. Garrett stood up, his eyes locking onto Meredith. The warmth he had shown his daughter vanished, replaced by the cold, razor-sharp intensity of an elite commander. "If you want to make your meeting in Chicago, miss." "Sterling, I suggest you and your associates board immediately," he said, his tone professional and entirely clinical. "We have a 5-minute window before the weather front completely locks down the northern corridor. And once we are airborne, my cockpit is a democracy of one. You sit down, you buckle up, and you do not speak to the crew. Understood?" Meredith swallowed hard, her throat tight. She could only manage a stiff, silent nod. The proud, untouchable CEO was completely powerless in his presence. As they began the walk up the platinum boarding stairs, Julian Cross hurried alongside them, his face pale as he kept staring at Garrett's calloused hands. "Captain Vance," Julian stammered, "the automated stabilization loop is still active. The yoke is going to fight us the moment we pass 80 knots on the runway. If the computer overrides your manual inputs, the nose will pitch down into the concrete." Garrett paused on the top step of the aircraft, looking out over the nose of the massive jet. The sky at the edge of the horizon was already turning a dark, bruised purple as the storm approached. "Then we just have to make sure I don't let it override me," Garrett said quietly. He stepped inside the cabin, the heavy hydraulic door beginning to seal them inside, leaving the ground crew below in a state of absolute, breathless shock. The cabin of the Gulfstream G650 was a sanctuary of cream leather, polished walnut, and brushed platinum, but inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was thick with cold adrenaline. Garrett Vance slid into the commander's left seat, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his stained canvas coveralls. The contrast was staggering, a man covered in the grime of the maintenance bay sitting at the helm of the world's most advanced civilian aerospace platform. He adjusted the seat, his movements deliberate and entirely devoid of rush. Behind him, securely buckled into the observer's jump seat, Chloe adjusted her small backpack, her eyes wide as she tracked her father's hands moving across the instrument panel. First Officer Julian Cross was sweating through his crisp, white uniform shirt. His fingers trembled as he brought up the primary flight display. Captain, the system is cycling again, Julian whispered, his voice cracking under the pressure. The 882 Delta error is mutating. It's locking the primary hydraulic actuators on the tail section. If we try to taxi, we won't even make it to the turnoff. Meredith Sterling did not take her seat in the main cabin. She stood just outside the open cockpit door, her fingers tightly gripping the polished wood bulkhead. Her emerald jacket was unbuttoned, her perfect hair slightly disheveled from the wind on the tarmac. Her intense, calculating gaze was fixed on the back of Garrett's head. She was waiting for him to fail. She was waiting for the illusion to break, secretly hoping her money and status hadn't just forced her to rely on a madman. Garrett didn't look back at her. He reached up to the overhead panel, flipping 3 shielded toggle switches in a sequence that wasn't listed in any commercial operating manual. Julian, flip the secondary flight control bus to manual standby, Garrett ordered, his voice low, steady, and commanding. But Captain, the manual says that we'll isolate the autopilot completely, Julian protested, his eyes wide. We'll be flying raw data through the storm. Do it, Julian, Garrett said, a quiet ferocity in his tone that silenced the first officer instantly. As Julian reached for the switch, the entire 40-ton aircraft suddenly shuddered violently. A loud, metallic groan echoed from the rear tail section as the corrupted flight computer attempted to force the stabilizers into a maximum downward deflection. The nose gear compressed sharply, throwing Meredith forward against the bulkhead. Inside the cockpit, a piercing master caution horn began to blare, its rhythmic, high-pitched wail filling the enclosed space with pure panic. The digital displays flashed a violent, blinding amber. Meredith lost her breath, her face turning entirely pale. The absolute control she maintained over her multi-billion-dollar empire evaporated in an instant. In the boardroom, she was a predator, but here, trapped in a shaking tube of aluminum, she was entirely helpless. She looked at the flashing red lights, her chest heaving, her hands trembling so hard she could barely hold onto the doorframe. The realization hit her like an icy wave. All her wealth, her influence, and her power could not silence the warning horn. She was completely vulnerable, stripped of her armor, and terrorized by the absolute lack of control. Chloe gasped, her small hands clutching the armrests of the jump seat, her eyes filling with tears as the loud horn echoed through her ears. "Daddy!" she cried out, her voice small and terrified. Garrett didn't freeze. While Julian panicked, staring blankly at the cascading error messages, Garrett turned his torso completely around. He reached back, wrapping his large, warm, grease-stained hand over Chloe's tiny, trembling fingers. He didn't raise his voice to speak over the alarm. He didn't yell. Instead, he projected an unshakable, quiet masculinity that acted like a physical shield against the chaos. "Look at me, Chloe," Garrett said, his voice incredibly soft, yet completely penetrating the noise of the cockpit. His eyes were calm pools of absolute certainty. "Look at my eyes, sweetheart. What is the rule?" "The airplane is just loud," Chloe whispered, her lower lip trembling as she stared into her father's steady gaze. "But you are louder." "That's right," Garrett murmured, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "The machine is just throwing a tantrum because it doesn't want to go to work today. But I am in charge, not the computer. I need you to be my brave co-pilot and count the runway lights for me. Can you do that?" Chloe swallowed hard, the terror vanishing from her face as quickly as it had arrived. She wiped a tear from her cheek and nodded bravely. "I can do that, Daddy." Meredith witnessed the entire interaction, paralyzed by the sheer emotional weight of the moment. She watched the little girl instantly find perfect peace in the middle of a mechanical nightmare, purely because of the calm strength radiating from the man in the grease-stained jumpsuit. Meredith looked at Garrett's steady hands, then at her own trembling fingers. The contrast was devastating. She had everything the world could offer: money, prestige, power, except the one thing this humble single father possessed effortlessly: absolute internal peace. This man gave safety without even trying. Garrett turned back to the controls, his face hardening into granite. He bypassed the touchscreens entirely. Using his left hand, he entered a highly classified 7-digit maintenance key code directly into the legacy engineering subpanel hidden beneath the throttle quadrant. Julian gasped as the digital displays suddenly transformed, the commercial interface vanishing, replaced by a stark, green-line military diagnostic screen. The master caution horn cut off instantly, plunging the cockpit into a sudden, heavy silence. "My God," Julian whispered, staring at the screen. "That's a Level 5 manufacturer core override. Only the experimental development teams at Sovereign Aerospace have those clearance codes. Who are you?" Garrett ignored the question, his hands gripping the heavy mechanical yoke. He unlocked the brakes and nudged the throttles forward. The massive turbines roared to life, a deep, powerful vibration humming through the floorboards as the jet began to taxi toward the dark, storm-swept runway. "We are out of time," Garrett said coldly, watching the first heavy drops of rain begin to explode against the windshield. "The storm is here. Julian, set takeoff flaps." As the aircraft lined up on the center line of runway 6, the wind howled against the fuselage, and the primary flight computer screen suddenly flashed a single ominous text string across the green interface. "Man override engaged. Stability. Ballet active." Garrett's knuckles turned white on the throttles. He looked into the blackness of the approaching storm, the moment of absolute truth arriving as the engines screamed for release. The twin turbines screamed with an ear-splitting howl as Garrett Vance shoved the throttles forward to the detent. The 40-ton Gulfstream bounded down the rain-slicked concrete of runway 6, acceleration pinning everyone back into their seats. Outside, the world blurred into a gray smear of water and asphalt. 80 knots, Julian Cross called out, his voice shaking violently as he stared at the digital airspeed indicator. 90. "Captain, the yoke! It's starting!" The primary mechanical control column suddenly came alive, twitching and jerking with terrifying force. The corrupted flight control computer, desperate to enforce its flawed calibration loop, began violently fighting Garrett's hands. The yoke slammed forward, attempting to force the nose gear back into the ground and destroy the aircraft at high speed. Julian completely froze. His hands hovered over the controls, paralyzed by the raw mechanical violence of the system. "It's locking up! Abort! We have to abort!" he screamed, his professional composure shattering into pure, unadulterated panic. "We are past V1, Garrett said, his voice dropping into a chilling, absolute stillness that cut through Julian's hysterics like a knife. "We are committed to the air. Touch nothing, Julian." Garrett's massive forearm muscles bulged against the fabric of his canvas coveralls. His hands gripped the bucking yoke with a precision that bordered on superhuman. He didn't just fight the computer, he anticipated it. Every time the automated system attempted a violent downward pitch, Garrett executed a microsecond counter-correction, applying the exact opposite pressure required to trick the secondary stabilization sensors. It was a brutal, physical duel between human muscle and corrupted algorithms. From the cockpit entryway, Meredith Sterling watched the nightmare unfold. She had been a titan in the corporate world, ruthlessly dismantling competitors and dictating terms to international conglomerates. But right now, staring at the violently shaking control column and the terrified, sweating face of her high-priced first officer, she felt completely insignificant. She realized that Julian, the man she paid top-tier executive rates to fly her, was completely useless when the illusion of safety vanished. Her eyes darted to Garrett. He wasn't sweating. He wasn't yelling. He was a monument of quiet masculinity, a warrior in his natural element, effortlessly holding the line between life and death. 120 knots. Chloe's small voice piped up from the jump seat behind them. Her face was pale, but her eyes were locked onto the window, watching the runway markers pass. 1, 2, 3 lights, Daddy. "Good job, Bug," Garrett murmured, his eyes fixed on the horizon line, his hands executing another lightning-fast adjustment to the pitch trim. "Keep counting for me." Hearing the little girl's calm voice in the middle of a near-fatal takeoff sequence hit Meredith like a physical blow. A profound wave of shame washed over her. Just 20 minutes ago, she had stood on the tarmac, basking in the cheap adoration of her sycophantic assistants, throwing arrogant insults at a man who was now casually rescuing her from her own pride. If she had forced a standard commercial crew into this cockpit, they would be dead on the tarmac right now. Her multi-billion-dollar empire, her 9-figure merger, her entire legacy meant absolutely nothing if she didn't survive the next 10 seconds. "Rotate," Garrett commanded softly. With a final, massive surge of physical effort, he hauled back on the control column, forcing the jet's nose toward the sky just as the automated system made one final, desperate attempt to lock the stabilizers. The aircraft groaned, the tires breaking contact with the concrete, and the Gulfstream launched itself into the dark, churning belly of the storm front. The moment they entered the clouds, absolute darkness swallowed the cabin. The aircraft was hit by a massive wall of turbulence, throwing the jet into a sharp 15-degree bank to the left. The digital displays flickered wildly, the green military interface flashing a warning, "Actuator saturation near critical." Julian let out a whimpering gasp, gripping the edge of the glare shield. We're losing the left wing! The computer is cutting hydraulic pressure to the ailerons! Meredith lost her footing as the floor tilted violently. She fell hard against the leather seat of the main cabin bulkhead, her hands scraping against the wood veneer. The sheer violence of the storm, combined with the screaming jet engines, made her feel entirely small. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The corporate queen was gone. She was just a terrified passenger trapped in a tempest, completely dependent on the steady hand of a single dad she had treated like dirt. She closed her eyes, trembling, waiting for the impact. "Julian, cycle the auxiliary hydraulic pump manually," Garrett ordered, his voice remaining a perfect, unshakable anchor. He kicked the right rudder pedal, forcing the nose back into alignment through sheer manual dominance. "Stop looking at the warnings. Look at the horizon bar. Keep the wings level on the backup analog gauge." Garrett's absolute calm seemed to act as a physical force in the cockpit, slowly pulling Julian back from the edge of hysteria. The first officer threw the auxiliary pump switch, and a deep, reassuring hum vibrated through the floorboards. The jet stabilized, cutting through the dense, heavy cloud layer as it continued its steep, aggressive climb toward the safety of the upper atmosphere. Garrett maintained his iron grip on the yoke, his eyes never wavering from the instrument panel. He had wrestled the machine into submission, but as the aircraft climbed higher into the heart of the storm, a new, structural crisis began to brew in the darkness outside. The altitude indicator crawled past 17,000 feet, but the storm showed no mercy. Sheets of freezing rain crystallized instantly across the cockpit windshield, turning the glass into a jagged, opaque shield of white ice. The engine cowl anti-ice systems were struggling to keep up with the sudden drop in temperature, and the deep, throaty roar of the turbofans began to take on an unstable, uneven vibration. Julian Cross was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically between the vibrating engine gauges and the horizon bar. "Captain, the wing anti-ice is failing on the left side," he stammered, his fingers trembling as he stabbed at the bleed air switches. "The left wing is gathering ice faster than the right. We're getting asymmetrical lift. The computer is going to try to dump the trim again." "It won't dump anything because I'm not letting it talk to the control surfaces," Garrett replied, his voice a flat line of pure ice. He adjusted his grip on the heavy mechanical yoke. The physical strain was starting to show. The veins in his forearms were corded tightly, his knuckles white as he manually counteracted the uneven drag pulling the nose toward the freezing darkness. In the cabin entryway, Meredith Sterling sat huddled on the lower step, her knees pulled toward her chest. Her billion-dollar empire, her ruthless negotiation tactics, her absolute authority over thousands of men and women, none of it could stop the terrifying metallic groan of the airframe as it fought the storm. When the jet plummeted 300 feet in a sudden, violent downdraft, a choked, broken sob finally escaped her throat. She pressed her face into her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. The invincible CEO was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified woman who realized that all her wealth couldn't buy a single breath of clean air or a second of safety. She was completely, utterly helpless. Chloe turned her head from the jump seat, observing the powerful woman's breakdown with the innocent clarity only a child possessed. She unbuckled her harness with practiced ease, slid out of the seat, and walked over to Meredith. The jet jolted again, but Chloe timed her steps perfectly, a pilot's daughter through and through. She knelt down beside Meredith and placed a small, warm hand on the woman's trembling shoulder. "Don't cry, lady," Chloe said softly, her voice incredibly sweet and entirely devoid of fear. "The airplane is just having a bumpy dream. My daddy is holding the steering wheel. When he holds it, nothing bad is allowed to happen. He's the strongest daddy in the whole world." Meredith looked up, her eyes red, her flawless makeup ruined by tears. She looked at the little girl, then passed her to the silhouette of the man in the left seat. Garrett hadn't flinched during the drop. He was completely synchronized with the machine, his body absorbing the shocks, his hands delivering micro-corrections before the aircraft could even begin to roll. Meredith wiped her face with a trembling hand, a profound, aching realization settling deep within her chest. She had spent her entire life chasing power, believing that money was the ultimate shield against the world's chaos. Yet here, in the darkest sky she had ever seen, true power didn't belong to the woman with the 9-figure net worth. It belonged to a humble father in oil-stained clothes who gave absolute safety to everyone around him without even trying. She had everything the world could offer, except the very peace that filled this cockpit. "Julian, look at the exhaust gas temperature on engine number 1, Garrett commanded, his eyes tracking a sudden drop in airspeed. The pitot tubes are freezing over. The digital airspeed indicator is lying to us. It's showing a false stall warning. Julian looked at the primary flight display, which was suddenly flashing a massive red stall warning, accompanied by a synthetic voice screaming into their headsets. "Stall! Pull up, stall! Pull up!" The first officer grabbed the glare shield, his voice rising in terror. "We're stalling! We're falling out of the sky! Pull back on the yoke, Captain! Pull back." "If I pull back, we actually will stall and spin into the ground," Garrett said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute terrifying command that instantly froze Julian's hand. "The airspeed is false, Julian. Look at the angle of attack and the engine performance management indicators. We have plenty of velocity. The computer is trying to trick us into killing ourselves." Garrett smoothly eased the yoke forward, pushing the nose down directly into the dark, churning heart of the cloud layer, completely defying the screaming automated warning system. He executed a highly irregular, subtle slip-slide maneuver, letting the tail wag slightly to shed the asymmetrical ice buildup on the left wing through aerodynamic friction alone. Julian watched the maneuver in absolute, breathless awe. The warning voice suddenly cut out as the dynamic airflow cleared the frozen sensors. The jet stabilized, cutting through the turbulence with newfound smoothness. Julian turned his head slowly, staring at Garrett's profile with a look of sudden, staggering recognition. "The Vanguard Drift," Julian whispered, his face turning entirely pale. "I read about that flight profile in the classified Air Force Academy archives. It's an unlisted recovery maneuver designed for experimental Delta Wing prototypes when their fly-by-wire computers experience a total sensor wash. Only one test pilot ever successfully executed that maneuver during the Avalon trials over the Nevada range before the program went dark. The pilot who vanished after the civilian transport tragedy. Spectre 6. Garrett kept his eyes fixed on the gray void outside, his expression as unreadable as granite. "Focus on your gauges, First Officer," he said quietly. "We aren't out of the woods yet." Before Julian could answer, the secure military diagnostic screen on the center console suddenly began to flash a violent, pulsing crimson. A high-frequency, encrypted audio tone burst through the cockpit speakers, followed by a cold, synthesized, computerized voice that sent an icy spike of adrenaline straight through the room. "Warning. Radar lock detected. Weapons tracking active. Naval Air Station Blackwood Automated Defense Grid has identified this airframe as an authorized target under military restricted airspace violation. You have 60 seconds to comply or engage transversal countermeasures." Julian Crossface went completely bloodless. "Radar lock?" He shrieked, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his digital navigation charts onto the floorboards. "Captain, we drifted directly into the restricted airspace of the Blackwood Naval Testing Range during that storm evasion maneuver. They have automated surface-to-air missile batteries tracking us right now. They'll shoot us down. We're a rogue civilian target to them." Meredith Sterling scrambled to her feet from the cabin floor, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it felt like it would break through her chest. The cold, synthetic voice counting down the seconds inside the cockpit felt like a literal death sentence. She looked at Garrett, her eyes wide with a terrifying primal fear. Her multi-billion-dollar empire, her board of directors, her massive bank accounts, none of it could stop a military missile. "Do something," she pleaded, her corporate authority entirely shattered, her voice cracking into a desperate whisper. "Please, my life, your daughter, we're all going to die up here." Garrett didn't let the panic touch his features. His eyes remained locked on the primary flight path, his hands steadily holding the heavy mechanical yoke as the jet sliced through the upper layers of the storm. He didn't yell, he didn't scramble. He simply reached out with his right hand, flipped open a heavy, guarded red toggle switch on the lower bulkhead console that Julian hadn't even noticed before, and keyed the high-frequency military tactical radio. "Blackwood Command, this is Spectre 6, Garrett said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, slicing through the cockpit alarms with absolute, unquestionable sovereignty. "Transmitting secure encryption handshake protocol Alpha Bravo 9er. Stand down your batteries. I am currently commanding a civilian asset under emergency waiver conditions. Repeat, stand down." A heavy, suffocating silence filled the cockpit as the digital countdown on the center console reached 15 seconds. Then, abruptly, the crimson flashing on the defense grid screen vanished. The screaming alarm died, replaced by a soft, steady green light. The radio crackled back to life, but the computerized voice was gone. Instead, the deeply shaken, trembling voice of a high-ranking military air traffic commander boomed through the speakers. "Spectre 6? The commander breathed, his tone laced with absolute disbelief and profound, reverent awe. "Captain Vance? Sir, we thought you were retired. The system flagged your old biometric handshake code. The entire Blackwood defense grid is standing down immediately. You have unrestricted priority vectoring through all restricted airspace. It is an absolute honor to hear your voice on the net again, sir. Godspeed." Julian sat paralyzed in his seat, staring at Garrett as if he were looking at a ghost. You really are him," Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "The chief development pilot for the entire experimental stealth program. The military aviation world has been looking for you for 3 years." Garrett didn't acknowledge the praise. He simply clicked off the radio and pulled back slightly on the yoke. With a massive, smooth surge of power, the Gulf Stream punched through the very top of the dark storm clouds, exploding into the brilliant, blinding blue of the upper atmosphere. The turbulent shaking stopped instantly. The cabin was suddenly bathed in pure, serene sunlight. Meredith stood frozen in the entryway, looking at Garrett's profile illuminated by the sun. The absolute shock of what she had just witnessed left her entirely speechless. She had spent her entire career believing that money was the ultimate force in the universe, that her corporate title made her untouchable. But she had just watched a military base, a network of weapons that could destroy a city, bow down in absolute reverence to the man she had called a grease pit mechanic. The sheer depth of her own ignorance and arrogance crushed her. She felt smaller than she ever had in her life. Chloe unbuckled her seatbelt again, stepping past Meredith with a bright, triumphant smile. "See? I told you," Chloe said proudly, her little voice filled with pure joy. "My daddy always fixes the bad dreams." Garrett turned his head slightly, his expression softening instantly as he looked at his daughter. "Good counting, Bug," he said, his voice returning to that warm, grounding, fatherly tone. "We're in clear skies now. Why don't you go sit in the big leather chair in the back and pick out your favorite cartoon? We'll be on the ground in Chicago very soon." Chloe nodded happily and skipped into the main cabin, leaving Meredith standing alone with the single father. Meredith walked forward slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The cold, intimidating CEO was completely gone. She looked at Garrett, her lips parting, but no words came out. The humiliation she felt wasn't from a public insult. It was the quiet, devastating humiliation of her own soul, realizing how profoundly wrong she had been about the value of a human being. "Captain Vance," she finally managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. You saved my life. You saved my daughter's father figure. You saved everyone on this plane, and I treated you like an insect on the tarmac." Garrett kept his eyes on the horizon, his hands guiding the multi-million-dollar jet with effortless grace. "Your apology is noted, Miss Sterling," he said quietly. "But we aren't on the ground yet. The primary flight computer is still attempting to override the manual controls every time we change pitch. I have to fly this profile completely by hand until the tires touch the concrete at Midway Executive." He nudged the throttles forward, accelerating the aircraft to its maximum cruising velocity. Below them, the storm raged, but up in the sunlight, Garrett Vance was in total command. However, as the skyscrapers of Chicago began to pierce through the distant cloud layer, the radio crackled again. The corporate headquarters ground crew was patching through, and they weren't alone. Meredith's primary business rivals and the entire regional FAA inspection team were waiting at the terminal, prepared to immediately seize the aircraft for a safety violation the moment it landed. The flight data displays began to compute the descent profile for Chicago's terminal radar approach control. Garrett Vance kept his hands firmly on the yoke, feeling the persistent, subtle resistance of the corrupted flight computer trying to twitch against his inputs. It was an exhaustive, relentless physical effort, but his breathing remained perfectly rhythmic. Meredith Sterling slipped into the empty observer seat behind him, the space Chloe had occupied before wandering into the main cabin. The sharp, untouchable corporate predator was entirely absent. Her emerald suit jacket was folded neatly over her arm, revealing the simple lines of her white silk blouse. She looked at the back of Garrett's head, her voice quiet, almost hesitant, a stark departure from the razor-sharp tone she used to command boardrooms. "Why didn't you tell them who you were?" she asked softly, her eyes tracking the precise, calculated movements of his hands. Back on the tarmac. When I insulted you, when I threw that ridiculous dare in your face, you could have crushed my ego in a single second by just telling me your name. Garrett didn't look back at her, his eyes scanning the horizon as the high-altitude blue began to give way to the pale haze of the lower atmosphere. A man who has to scream his name to prove his worth doesn't actually have any, he said, his deep voice carrying a quiet, unshakable masculinity. My credentials don't change the oil leaks in a hydraulic line, Miss Sterling. They don't pick Chloe up from school. Out there on the runway, I was a mechanic doing a job. Your opinion of my clothes didn't alter the reality of what I can do. Meredith swallowed hard, feeling a strange, tight knot form in her throat. The sheer emotional security radiating from him was intoxicating. In her world, everyone was a performer, constantly shouting their achievements, wearing their wealth like armor, and using their status to intimidate others. She had lived her entire life under the impression that total control over people and markets was the only true form of safety. But looking at Garrett, whose hands were covered in grease, and who chose to live in absolute anonymity just to be a present father, she realized she had it completely backward. He didn't need a title because he was the anchor. Julian said you were a legend, she murmured, leaning slightly forward, her scent briefly cutting through the faint smell of aviation fuel in the cockpit. He said the entire military aviation world has been looking for you. You could have commanded any airline, any experimental project, any multi-million-dollar defense contract. You could be a billionaire, Garrett. Why choose a grease pit? Because when I was chasing the horizon, I wasn't looking at what was right in front of me, he said quietly. The high-stakes world, the testing contracts, the endless deployments, they require you to surrender your time. And time is the only currency that actually matters. When my wife died, I realized that Chloe didn't need a decorated hero on a television screen or a rich father who sent checks from a luxury hotel. She needed a dad who was there to make her breakfast, who could listen to her stories, and who was awake when she had a nightmare. I traded the sky for her stability, Miss Sterling. And it's the best bargain I've ever made. Meredith stared at him, a rare, genuine tear slipping down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. The realization was profound and devastating. She had everything, except peace. She had spent her life acquiring companies, expanding her net worth, and treating people like numbers on a spreadsheet, yet she returned every night to an empty penthouse, filled with nothing but the crushing anxiety of the next day's market opening. This man, living on a mechanic's salary, possessed a wealth she couldn't even fathom. Midway Executive Tower. Spectre 6 is established on the localizer for runway 4. Wright Garrett announced into the radio, his voice snapping the cockpit back into professional precision. Spectre 6, you are cleared to land runway 4, right. Winds are calm. Be advised, we have an active ground notification for your arrival. Federal authorities and private security are staging at the Sterling Global Private Terminal. Julian Cross looked over at Garrett, his face filled with sudden dread. Captain, the ground telemetry loop must have broadcast our manual override sequence to the corporate maintenance servers. Preston Hayes is down there. Meredith's entire body went rigid at the mention of the name. Preston Hayes was the ruthless chairman of Hayes Aerospace, her primary corporate rival and the co-signer of the pending 9-figure merger. He had been looking for any legal loophole to disqualify her firm from the contract and seize controlling interest. He's brought the regional FAA safety inspection team, Julian whispered, staring at his ground communications monitor. They're flagging the flight as an unauthorized operation of a compromised airframe. They're going to arrest you the moment the engines cut out, Captain. They're claiming you hijacked the aircraft. Meredith stood up, her eyes flashing with a sudden protective fury that surprised even herself. They won't touch him, she hissed, her corporate armor slamming back into place. But this time, she wasn't fighting for her own ego, she was fighting for the man who had saved her. I am the CEO of Sterling Global. I authorized this flight. It doesn't matter, Miss Sterling, Julian said, his voice trembling. The FAA manual states that operating an aircraft with a hard 882 Delta error without a certified manufacturer representative on board is a federal violation. Preston Hayes has the legal leverage to invalidate the merger and have Captain Vance blacklisted from aviation forever. The private jet glided through the lower clouds, the runway appearing ahead like a gray ribbon flanked by the imposing skyline of Chicago. Garrett Vance didn't say a word. His hands remained steady on the yoke, tracking the glide slope perfectly, utterly unfazed by the storm waiting for him on the ground. He flared the aircraft precisely over the numbers, and the heavy tires touched the concrete with a whisper-soft smoothness that defied the broken computer systems. As the Gulfstream taxied toward the sprawling, modern glass terminal of the Sterling Global private hangar, the scene outside became clear. 3 black Federal SUVs with flashing amber lights were parked in a neat semicircle. Standing in front of them was a man in a pristine charcoal bespoke suit, flanked by 2 armed federal marshals and a team of stern-faced safety inspectors. Preston Hayes was smiling, holding a stack of legal injunction papers in his hand. Garrett smoothly brought the jet to a stop, pulled the thrust levers back to shut down the massive turbines, and unbuckled his harness. He turned around to look at Meredith, his expression as calm and unreadable as the day they met. "Get Chloe's backpack, miss." "Sterling," Garrett said quietly, his voice a steady anchor in the rising tension. "It's time to go downstairs and finish this." The heavy hydraulic boarding stairs of the Gulfstream lowered with a sharp metallic hiss, slicing through the cool, damp Chicago air. Garrett Vance stepped out first, his worn leather work boots touching the pristine concrete of the Midway Executive Terminal. In his right arm, he securely held Chloe, who was sleepy but completely calm, her chin resting comfortably on his broad shoulder. Meredith Sterling followed directly behind them. Her emerald suit jacket was gone, her silk shirt was slightly rumpled, but her posture had hardened into a mask of absolute defiance. Preston Hayes stepped forward from the semicircle of black federal vehicles, his polished leather shoes clicking loudly against the tarmac. His face was twisted into a triumphant, condescending grin as he held up a thick manila folder of legal documents. "Meredith," he called out, his voice booming across the runway with arrogant satisfaction, "I must commend your absolute desperation. Flying through a level 5 storm front in a structurally compromised aircraft just to make a signing deadline? It is a pity the Federal Aviation Administration does not share your appreciation for melodrama. This flight was an unauthorized, illegal operation of a grounded asset. Your corporate operating charter is being suspended, the merger is legally dead, and your little pet mechanic here is going to spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary for air piracy." The 2 armed federal marshals flanking the inspectors took a step forward, their hands moving toward the heavy steel restraints on their utility belts. Julian Cross, exiting the cockpit behind Meredith, looked as though he might faint on the spot. Garrett did not move an inch. He did not lower Chloe, nor did he shift his weight. He simply adjusted his grip on his daughter, looked directly past Preston Hayes, and locked his gaze onto the lead safety inspector, Director Silas Thorne. "Director Thorne," Garrett said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that carried an immediate, unshakable authority. "Before your men take another step, I suggest you pull up the primary server logs for the Hayes Aerospace Maintenance Network. Check the outbound data packet transmitted to Crestview Airfield at exactly 11:40 a.m. today." Thorne frowned, his professional, bureaucratic demeanor faltering slightly at the absolute lack of fear in the mechanic's voice. "And why exactly would I do that?" Because the 882 Delta error that locked the stabilizers on this aircraft wasn't an accidental mechanical loop, Garrett stated clearly, his calm words cutting through the tension like a razor. It was a remote command override exploit, intentionally injected through a proprietary maintenance bridge owned exclusively by Hayes Aerospace. Mr. Hayes didn't just wait for Miss Sterling to fail. He used his own firm's administrative software access to deliberately sabotage her flight control computer, forcing a catastrophic stabilization loop to ensure this plane could never leave the ground. Preston's face instantly flushed a violent, angry crimson. "This is absolute, unmitigated slander," he screamed, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at Garrett. "He is a line mechanic trying to invent a conspiracy to avoid a prison sentence. Director Thorne, arrest him immediately." "I wrote the source code for that specific architecture, Preston," Garrett said softly, his voice dropping into a chilling register of absolute, unquestionable sovereignty. The entire tarmac went dead silent. The wind seemed to die down, leaving nothing but the faint cooling click of the jet engines. Director Thorne froze, his eyes widening as he looked from his diagnostic tablet up to the man in the grease-stained canvas coveralls. "Sovereign Aerospace doesn't own those core encryption keys," Garrett continued, taking a single step forward, his powerful frame completely dominating the space between them. "I do. My name is on the original global defense patents for the dual-channel telemetry bus. When I activated the Level 5 core override in flight, it didn't just clear the stabilization error, it traced the digital signature of the exploit back to its originating server. The source IP address belongs directly to your private office terminal in downtown Chicago. Director Thorne looked down at his tablet, which was suddenly pulsing with a high-priority federal notification forwarded directly from the command staff at the Blackwood Naval Air Station. Thorne's hand began to shake as he scrolled through the multi-layered government clearance document on his screen. The document didn't list a mechanic's certification. It displayed an active, high-level military mandate. Thorne swallowed hard, his face turning entirely pale as he looked back up at Garrett. "Captain Vance," Thorne said, his voice completely stripped of its previous coldness, replaced by a profound, trembling reverence. "The Pentagon has just verified your active status under the Phoenix Protocol. Your emergency military authority completely supersedes civilian FAA jurisdiction in this sector. Marshals, stand down immediately." The two federal marshals stopped instantly, lowering their hands from their belts and stepping away from Garrett. Thorne turned his gaze toward a frantic, sweating Preston Hayes. "Mr. Hayes, based on the real-time telemetry data forwarded directly from Captain Vance's cockpit and the secondary verification from the Naval Defense Grid, you are under arrest for industrial espionage, intentional sabotage of a civilian transport, and reckless endangerment of a federal asset." The marshals moved with fluid, practiced efficiency. They grabbed Preston's arms, forcing them behind his back, and ratcheted the cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. Preston began to scream, his expensive bespoke suit wrinkling as he was forcibly dragged toward the rear seat of the black SUV. The crowd of corporate onlookers, legal advisors, and terminal staff watched in absolute breathless shock. The man who had arrived to conquer a multi-billion-dollar empire was leaving in the back of a police cruiser. Meredith Sterling watched the entire display, her chest heaving as a wave of profound universal justice washed over her. She looked at Garrett, the single father who had quietly dismantled a billionaire with nothing more than his mind and his unshakable dignity. She stepped forward slowly, her eyes bright with a deep, transformed respect. She reached out, her hand resting gently on the coarse fabric of his canvas sleeve. "Garrett," she said, her voice softer than it had ever been in her life, "you didn't just save my life up there. You saved everything I've ever built. Name your price." "Chief of Global Flight Operations, a full partnership in Sterling Global, a blank check, whatever you want. It is yours. I want you by my side." Garrett looked down at Chloe, who was yawning softly, her small fingers curling into the fabric of his collar. He turned back to Meredith, offering her a slow, gentle smile, the smile of a man who already possessed everything he could ever need. "Thank you for the offer, Miss Sterling," Garrett said quietly, his voice a steady, grounding anchor. "But, as I told you before, my time is already bought and paid for. The corporate world doesn't have a currency that can interest me. I have a very important appointment to keep." Meredith stared at him, the realization final and beautiful. She didn't press him. She didn't try to negotiate. She simply nodded, a profound sense of peace settling into her own heart for the very first time. "Ice cream?" she asked softly. "Ice cream," Garrett confirmed. He turned and began the long walk across the tarmac toward the terminal exit, his broad shoulders squared, his gait steady and purposeful. Chloe looked over his shoulder, waving her small hand at Meredith with a bright, happy grin. "Goodbye, lady," she called out. "Don't have any more bad dreams." Meredith watched them disappear into the warm light of the terminal building. The single dad in his work clothes, the true authority in the sky and on the ground, walking away from billions without a single shred of regret. She smiled, realizing that true power resided not in what you controlled, but in what you were strong enough to leave behind. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.